Hi there, everyone. Thank you for listening. I'm sitting here with Richard Vanderpyl. He is the head of school at the Christian Alliance International School. We are at the International Schools Festival put on by the South China Morning Post. So, Richard, first and foremost, I'm interested to hear what was your upbringing? What was the school like that you attended as a child?
Well, for me, Clark, I'm born and bred in New Zealand, and so for me, obviously, very much a Kiwi school. And so a sort of more of a bicultural school. We had Europeans, Māori, Pacifica, and for me, as you can imagine in New Zealand, just lots of fields, lots of green grass and areas to play around in, so that's very different to here. But a school that was very warm and affirming, a school that focused on really trying to develop us as individuals, which I really appreciated, and it was a local school. I walked to school or biked to school every day.
And you've already mentioned the outdoor setting being different, but I wanted to ask, how does that school differ now from the Christian Alliance International School?
Yeah, I think it differs in many ways, well, apart from obviously the facilities and the outdoor, but I think back when I was educated, and you can tell maybe by my age, 58, it was a very different style of education. And I think in those days, the education was really focused around productive skills, and it was for basically learning for a job. And because that was the nature of the economy in those days, I think it's changed very differently today. I think today our focus is a lot around those soft skills that go with the knowledge and go with the wisdom. So I think, my day, there was a lot of rote learning still. Here today, I think the focus is on critical thinking, collaboration and collegiality. I think some of those skills that we know really make our students strong participants in society. They're all going to get an academic education, but I think we today add a lot of those soft skills that weren't around earlier.
And to go off that, could you then describe what your general school culture is like?
Yeah, well, I think the culture forms people, doesn't it? And culture shapes people, and that's why I think it is so important to know the culture of the school, because it will shape that individual. So for us, our culture is very much it's a welcoming culture. We really want that environment where students feels that it's a place like home. In New Zealand, we have a Māori word for that. It's called te ranga waiwai. And te ranga waiwai means it's a place to stand. It's a place of identity. And homes are a place of standing and identity, but so too should schools. I think, but schools need to celebrate. They need to be places of laughter. You do need to hear noise. I'd be worried, if our school, the parents would say, it's so quiet in the school. It worries me a little bit, because it means that students are not talking, they're not engaging with the teacher. So I would like to see, good productive noise going on, lots of celebration. That to me, I think we see that in our school. We celebrate everybody. We see that everyone is uniquely gifted. So let's celebrate their gifts. I think our culture too, we talk about high expectations, and I say to the students, we have high expectations of them, but I actually say to the students, and you too need high expectations of your teachers. It's a two-way street, and so for me, high expectations is part of our culture as well.
Sure. So you mentioned, and I would agree, going back to the school that I grew up in, I'm not sure there was much noise going on. Yeah. And so could you describe a little more how that's encouraged? How is that implemented into the general day-to-day?
Oh, look, that is so good, because it does get to the heart. We know that when we're in the workplace, we're not going to sit in our own little silo, our own little cubicle where we don't communicate with others. That's not the workplace we're in, and that's not how we progress. So why should schools be different then if schools are preparing students for that future? So the way you encourage that is it's like the Socratic approach, which is, questioning. Teachers should be asking 100 questions a day, literally. Students should be asking 100 questions a day, because what it means is they're engaging with each other. They're asking each other questions. The teacher is asking the students to think. There is group work going on. There are activities that are not the students working individually, but collaboratively together, because that's the sort of skill we need for the future. So your curriculum, teachers can teach the curriculum by literally what we might say the sage on the stage. They just stand up there and they just talk. look, that kills everyone. You know, the students are just, they do not listen that long. So there has to be these episodes within the period, within the block, where students are listening and then they're active, then they listen, then they do something different, group work. So I think that's how you encourage it. And a good teacher knows when the noise is productive and when the noise is off task. And they're just listening for that, and, you know, just the nice little, you know, bring them back in. Yeah, thanks, guys. Well, that sounds a good conversation. But what do you think about this now? And just brings them slowly back on.
Sure. So we had some panel discussions earlier today. A topic that was brought up a lot was around personalization. And so I'm curious, you know, again, going off what you were just saying, at what point, you know, are you implementing, you know, with your teachers or the curriculum, whatever it may be? You have the overarching curriculum. You have, you know, these tracks that the students are on. But at what point, or how is personalization approached? You know, how is the individual student, depending on what they're doing?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
I know what you mean. And look, Clark, for me, the heart of that is, does the teacher know the student in front of them? And you know, notice I didn't say, does the teacher know the students in front? Well, a teacher will see their class of students, they see them, but do they see them also individually? And do they know them? And so, you know, my challenge to the teachers at Christian Alliance International School is that if I was to come into your class and say to you, tell me about this student, you could tell me about that student, about their ability, about what their interest is. Potentially, what did they do on the weekend? You know, if it's a Monday, you know, did you actually engage with them? So for me, that personalization is that the teachers must know each student individually, and then they can tailor what they're doing. They know which students, you know, are a little bit more shy, a little bit more reticent about putting their hand up. So don't just always wait for the kid who always puts their hand up. Work out a strategy to bring that out for that student. What about the student who's nervous about getting the answer wrong? Well, how do you build that resilience? How do you, you know, sort of give them the bravery to put their hand up and maybe get the answer wrong? But that's what a teacher should know. You know, there's just so many different ways. Now, you're right, Clark. There is the general curriculum that needs to be covered, and they're all going to learn certain mathematical concepts or English concepts and things like that. But how do you spark interest? And that's where you do get to know them. One student might have a lovely interest in bikes, you know, another one it's the Marvel superheroes, okay? So, you know, rather than say everybody, write a topic on butterflies, what are individual interests? But the teacher should know that as well.
Right. So we're here at the International Schools Festival. There's quite a lot of parents here walking around,
Yes.
introducing themselves to all the various booths at the schools. I'm curious, what questions have you heard today? And I would also say, what questions do you think parents should be asking to you or to anyone that's here?
Yeah, it really is interesting, and I think, you know, it is partly meeting the parents' expectations, and a school should do that, you know, so they obviously have their child's interests at heart. So, you know, there are the academic questions and there are the curriculum questions, and they are important, absolutely valid, no problem. I think questions they should be asking are, how do they, and it is age appropriate, but I would be asking things like, how do you know, Mr. Vanderpyl, that your students enjoy your school? How do you know that in teachers' rooms they're engaged in their learning? You know, where is the student voice within the school that you can then gauge just how engaged or how interested they are in their lessons? Because look, we all think we're doing a good job, and we do, you know, and teachers come to school wanting to do their very best. But unless we hear from the students about how engaged they are or how inspired they are, we often don't know that and get that feedback. So I'd be asking the head of school, do you do surveys with the students where they can actually give you feedback on that teacher? I think the other one that I would be asking about is, every school's going to do the academics, without a doubt. Every school's going to offer sports and ECAs. But the other question I'd be asking is, how do students put what they are learning into practice? You know, where does the curriculum get its purpose from? Because it shouldn't just reside in the head, it should result in some response, some action. So I'd be saying, you know, what service activities does your school do? You know, do the students go out? If they've just been learning about the environment, or they've just been learning about pollution, do they actually go out and do something about it? Picking up rubbish or whatever else, do they put it into practice? If your school talks about the importance of looking out for others, how do they do that in practice? Easy to say, but what does the school do to put it in practice? I'd be asking those sorts of questions as well.
That's great. So another question I have, with retrospect of COVID-19, I mean, we're still in it. We're not
Yes.
past it quite yet, but obviously last year was a very intense time for schools. There's a lot
Yes.
of online learning, things of that nature. I'm curious, in looking back, I imagine you've had conversations about what actual lessons can be learned. What have we learned that we can actually grasp on to move forward in pushing education as we move on from here? I'm curious, are there any lessons where you're able to now proactively do some things that you were taught during that tough time last year?
Yes. I think, in the nature of, say, the delivery of the curriculum, I think, we've all learnt, and in our school in particular, we've adapted quickly because we've had to. And so suddenly for some staff, technology wasn't a major feature of their teaching. Suddenly they've upskilled and they've gained a whole new range of skills. And we're saying to our staff, the best things out of that, keep them going in your classroom. And that's been really quite neat. I think that's been quite valuable. I think what it's also told us is the importance of preparing students, and it is, you could argue, for the future of uncertainty. And gone is the day in which, we just say, we just can predict what the future is going to be. So just study this and here's your path ahead and it'll finish there, it'll go into the next thing. That's gone. Who would have predicted the environment we're in? So I think that's again where schools have said, and we've said that, how do we build resilience within our students? Because there is going to be uncertainty in their life. There is going to be changes in their life. There are things coming out of left field and all of that. So how do we build up that ability? Now, not only of resilience, but also mental well-being. How do we give them strategies to cope with that and to be able to look after themselves, even emotionally and mentally as well?
So I just have one final question for you. As a parent, imagine I'm a parent asking you this question. What do you look for in the teachers that you're hiring?
Well, look, and at the heart of it, that is just so important because, the quality of the school does rest in many ways on the quality of the teachers. And that's a simplification of many other factors that come into it. What do we look for? I think competence is the first thing. I use the letter C as my little ways of remembering these things. So the first C is competence. Are they actually competent, and can they give evidence of their competence in that area? Because that's a key part. We're a Christian school at Christian Alliance International School, so the other C is, are they a Christian? Do they show that Christ-likeness? The other C is character. Do they have a good character? Are they the type of person that I would want my son or my daughter to be taught by because of their character? The other one is, would you believe it, chemistry? Now, not because of science, but do you think they'd be a good fit in the school? You know your own department. If they're going into that department, would they be a good fit knowing them? Because, that's an important part, that chemistry. But I think the last one for me, and it's the one that I have to hold the highest, and that is, can I see and can I feel a sense of calling? That's my last C, calling. Do you really see that they actually want to be a teacher? They're in it because they want to do something with students. They want to, inspire the next generation. They've got a love for teaching. Teaching's hard work, and if they don't have that calling, then it becomes a burden. So I think for me, Clark, those are my C's that I use.
There we go, the 5 C's. I love it. Richard Vanderpyl, head of school at Christian Alliance International School. Thank you so much for answering these questions. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Clark. Thank you.